We're looking at and interested at growing the economic opportunity for Georgians across the state. We want to build a strong workforce to make sure that that effort is supported and to ensure that Georgia is a safe and healthy place for all of us to work for our families and our children and our future.
Senate Republican caucus members present their goals for the legislative session. Good evening and welcome to Lawmakers on this 8th day of the Georgia General Assembly. I'm Donna Lowry in Atlanta. A couple of Senate committees are looking at the challenges faced by the Georgia Department of Family and Children's Services when it comes to foster children who have intense behavioral problems. The children are often hard to place in foster homes, leaving the state to place them in hotels. The practice is known as hoteling. We have two guests on the show to talk about this issue, including the chair of the Senate Committee on Children and Families. Also on the show, my conversation with the president and CEO of the Georgia Chamber, who talks about economic growth and workforce issues, including the housing crisis for Georgia workers. Also, late today, Governor Brian Kemp made a preemptive move by declaring a state of emergency to prepare for the possibility of unrest when Memphis officials released the video of a deadly encounter between police and a Memphis man. It's also an attempt to avoid a repeat of the violence in downtown Atlanta by demonstrators last weekend over the death of a protester at the planned police training center in DeKalb County. Law enforcement agencies across the country have been put on high alert. Kemp's state of emergency declaration gives him the power to call up the National Guard to assist local law enforcement. But first, let's get right down to the Gold Dome, where our Capitol correspondent, Rochelle Ritchie, is standing by. Hi, Rochelle.
Hi, Donna. Well, a relatively quiet day at the Capitol. However, Democrats have filed two new gun bills that would require a background check and a 3-day waiting period for unlicensed person-to-person gun sales and transfers. But the big news of the day comes from Senate Republicans, who laid out their priorities for this session, which include efforts to lower the state income tax, stiffer penalties for crime, improving literacy rates, and preparing for the future of electric vehicles. Senate Republicans, accompanied by Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, say they are ready to get to work for Georgia.
I'm just here to show my support of this body, and it's been great working with the Majority Leader, Steve Gooch, and the Pro Tem, John Kennedy. In a brief press conference on the South Steps of the Capitol, the Majority Caucus laid out its priorities for the 2023 legislative session, which includes tax relief programs.
In the same vein, with high inflation and rapidly rising home values, taxpayers and homeowner relief initiatives being proposed by Governor Kemp are also important to this Senate body. It is prudent that we take into account how the implementation of these new programs will affect our goal of broader long-term tax reform, as lowering the income tax, which is a big priority of Lieutenant Governor Jones along with the Republican Senate.
As the influx of electric vehicles proves imminent and demands for infrastructure increase, Senate Republicans are excited about the job opportunities the EV industry presents, but are already exploring what it could mean for fuel tax revenue.
Manufacturers such as General Motors will no longer build a combustible engine after the year 2035. Well, you know, that's not far away from now. It's 12 years away. So if we're going to get rid of the combustible engine, that's the fuel tax that feeds the roads and bridge work over at the Department of Transportation, which is over $2 billion a year of revenue. So it's not impossible to think that in the future, it may be 20 or 30 years out, that we would lose a significant part of that motor fuel tax, and ultimately we could end up losing it all.
Senate Republicans have been very vocal about recruiting the best educated people for Georgia's workforce. And while graduation numbers have improved, addressing poor literacy rates remains a central focus.
The average literacy rate in the state of Georgia in 2021 for third grade students reading on the third grade level for the whole state of Georgia is 43.49%. That means that you would normally think that you got some people, some areas of Georgia that are 70 to 80%. We don't have a RESA district in the state of Georgia that the third grade children reading on the third grade level is more than 50%. So we can't ever develop a workforce going forward with all the jobs that this great body has put into place for the state of Georgia without children that can read.
And much like Governor Kemp, the caucus agenda includes a push for stiffer penalties related to gang activity and reform of the bail system.
In the session, we had already established common ground on several issues that we believe will lead to safer communities in our state's rural and urban areas. These include serious penalties for the recruitment of minors for gang activity, both mentioned as priorities of the governor and the lieutenant governor. Aggressive bail bond reform for violent offenses, also priority of the governor and the lieutenant governor. And just as important from a safety perspective, we will be backing enhanced school safety legislation that is a priority of Governor Kemp as well.
And lastly, Senate Republicans added that Senate Bill 3 will look at a comprehensive review for state employees and a tax audit review, which they will look at some 200 tax credits on the books. That's expected to be completed by December 1st. And also today, Senate Democrats have filed a bill to increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour. That is my Capitol Report. Donna, back to you.
Thanks so much, Rochelle. We're going to devote time now to a problem involving children in crisis. This week, the Senate Committees of Health and Human Services and Children and Family held a joint hearing and heard heartbreaking accounts of children the state is unable to place in foster homes. Many have severe behavioral problems. Joining me now to talk about this issue are Republican State Senator Kay Kirkpatrick of Marietta, who is the chair of the Senate Committee on Families and Children, and journalist Andy Miller with Kaiser Health News, who has spent some time looking into this issue. Thank you both for coming on the show. I want to start by playing snippets from the stories of two foster children who the Department of Family and Children Services, DFACS, had to place in hotels multiple times. You'll hear about a 12-year-old boy, but first a little about an 11-year-old girl who suffered trauma in her home life and ended up in the system.
She was hoteled for a month as we looked for placement. She was in a CSU once during that time and then went back to a CSU from October 29th to November 14th. Then she spent one night in a foster home where she was banging her head on a wall, hitting herself in the face, tried to electrocute herself, ran into a pond to try to drown herself, and then swallowed a pair of earrings. We sent a case manager to pick this child up who was too violent and too aggressive for a locked treatment facility. From April to August, he was in a hotel at a cost of over $186,000. He destroyed multiple hotel rooms, was exposing himself, breaking mirrors, threatened to kill people, threw a lamp, damaged cars, busted windows, and was taken to an ER 3 times and then released because no CSU would accept him. On July 31st, he was detained after hours of destruction of property, multiple law enforcement calls, and he was cutting and threatening to stab people. So if those 4 cases leave your heart heavy, and I'm sure it does, I have 453 more to tell you. That's the number of youth in foster care we've had to hotel so far this fiscal year.
Those stories are certainly hard to hear. And so, Chairman Kirkpatrick, we only heard 2 of the 4 she talked about, and there are so many more. Let's talk about, first of all, who these children are, what kind of behavioral issues we're talking about, and then what hoteling is all about.
Well, the children that were discussed in the hearing that we had yesterday are sort of extreme cases. They've kind of run out of options, and there's placement is non-existent really for kids like that. And hoteling basically is if there's not a place in a treatment facility, or they've already been through a treatment facility, they may or may not have been involved with the criminal justice system, and they can't go back to their home because of the dangerous behavior. There aren't a lot of choices in Georgia right now, and that's one of the things we're going to work on. But it requires a lot of resources to have a child in a hotel, because you can't just leave them there. You have to have people that are trained who can watch them and manage their behavior. And it's extremely expensive compared to other options that are in place.
So are they in the rooms by them? So there are people with them the whole time.
Right.
And that must be difficult too, because I'm sure those kids are not happy about where they are.
Right, and sometimes they need one person with them, sometimes they need more than one person. One of the cases that she mentioned, there were 3 people that were needed to handle this kid. And I think the cost that was quoted to us was about $1,500 a night. And Commissioner Brose really started this ball rolling when she gave her presentation to the Appropriations Committee and really opened a lot of eyes to this problem.
Right. I know that a lot of people had a lot of conversation around this when this came out last week. You've been looking into it. It's one of those things where there are no easy answers, right?
Well, they're not, and Georgia's not alone in having a hoteling problem, but we do know that on any given night there can be dozens of these children and youth who are in hotels, and they've fallen through the cracks, and these kids have suffered trauma to begin with because of where they are. They're foster kids, or they've just been adopted out of sometimes really bad situations, and so this is a problem, and I think the legislature is right and has done some good things in terms of focusing on this issue.
Yeah, I want to hear from somebody else in the hearing. Let's take a look at one of the problems in the system, and this is some of the testimony from a behavioral pediatrician.
For foster children in crisis, let's flip things around just like it is for emergency surgery. Instead of having to do a prior authorization before you can get services, do the prior authorization after the services. If they're not deemed medically necessary, then the guardian, which would be DFACS, is on the hook. But when you go to the emergency room and you need emergency surgery, there is no prior authorization that has to be done beforehand. It's all done after the services are provided.
Yeah. Chairman Kirkpatrick, can you talk about the difference between mental, behavioral health type issues and physical health and the problems there exist, this prior authorization?
Well, we addressed that to some degree last year with House Bill 1013 with mental health parity, which means that the insurance companies are required to treat mental health disorders the same as they do physical conditions. But prior authorization is a thorn in the side of all healthcare providers, and it means that basically once you decide on a treatment plan, you have to ask permission and get that approved by the insurance company. And we've done some legislation on that over the last couple of years, and one of the things is that it's not required in emergency cases. So Medicaid is a little bit different. Foster kids are under Medicaid because they have federal guidelines and they're managed by a contract. And so I think she had a great point that it would be really good if you didn't have to jump through hoops that can delay care and really eat up a lot of time before you can get somebody where they need to be.
In the meantime, these kids are suffering. I want to go to, before I talk to you, Andy, I want to go to another piece of sound from yesterday. And that was, this one is from someone from DFACS describing the scope of the problem.
The current system in place that we use to provide medical treatment for the approximate 11,000 foster children is not meeting the needs of the most vulnerable citizens. These children and youth's current access to medical treatment, be it routine, specialized, or federally mandated, is falling far short of our obligation to these children.
So what have you found as you've looked into this issue?
Well, it's not just foster kids who are in hotels. It's across the system. And many of them are just not getting the behavioral health services, the physical health services. I talked to a woman who has adopted several kids, and she has to wait months to get an appointment with a physician specialist. So it's broad, but the issues are that there is a contractor, and the state is finally looked at this problem, but many of these kids have autism or behavioral problems, and they just haven't gotten the services, and they sometimes haven't gotten the diagnosis and the evaluations that they need.
Yeah, and one of these things is a workforce issue too. Getting people to want to work with these children, and a lot of them are not getting paid enough for what they have to do.
That's exactly right. The reimbursement for providers could be a lot better and could attract some more people to accept this type of insurance situation. And there's some tweaking of coding and some other things that could be done as well. But you're right, it's hard under the best of circumstances, even if you do have commercial insurance, to find providers to take care of you with mental health conditions. And we know that there's a large percentage of kids in the foster system who sometimes end up in these horrible situations who do have autism. And one of the things that Dr. Zena talked about yesterday was early diagnosis and a comprehensive diagnosis. And that's so important because we need to be looking upstream at this problem and trying to prevent people from ending up in these situations.
What can your committee do? And it's a joint committee, as I mentioned.
Well, after Dr. Watson and I heard Commissioner Brose's presentation, we both agreed that we needed to gather some more information and make it public. And so that's how the joint hearing came about. The two committees are still separate, but Lieutenant Governor Jones prioritized this Children and Families Committee, and that's a brand new committee. It's never existed before, with the idea of addressing problems like foster care, adoption, and so on. So we've got a lot of work to do. We got a lot of good ideas out of the hearing yesterday, and I think it's not something we can fix overnight, but I think we can make some progress this year. And there are short-term, medium, and long-term solutions that we're going to have to work together on.
Unfortunately, we're out of time for today, but I want to have you both back as we move on with this session and find out about solutions. Thanks so much for coming on. Now, coming up, my interview with the CEO of the Georgia Chamber on the state's economic development boom, with new companies coming in and the challenging workforce issues that come with that.
Lawmakers is made possible by Georgia Farm Bureau. With over 80 years of helping everyone understand the importance of agriculture in our state. After all, ag is Georgia's #1 industry. Food and fiber production represents over $74 billion in output of Georgia's strong economy. The Georgia Farm Bureau legislative team works to represent producers across Georgia at the state capitol during the session and year-round. Georgia Farm Bureau, the voice of Georgia farmers.
Here's what's new this month with Passport.
You make a good team.
As long as we're together, it's perfect.
Dreams do come true. Hey, lad?
Seems they do.
Something deeply dangerous is happening here. This is just beginning.
These and all your favorite shows are available with Passport. Support your PBS station and stream more with Passport on the PBS app.
My heart is racing right now.
Fasten your seatbelt. This season we have 21 incredible guests.
It's wild.
It's really something. And there are so many highlights. I feel like a time traveler.
You're uncovering the truth.
These are consequential things.
Yeah.
Mind blown? What do you have? Spies working for you? How did you find this?
Oh, look at everybody.
You have a DNA cousin.
Oh my God!
That's Bill Hader. You know him?
Of course.
I wish my mom could be here to see this.
What?
That's very moving, actually.
Your ancestors came on the Mayflower.
I've got history. I feel the presence of all these people.
What a treasure. Those are some of the incredible stories of the new season of Finding Your Roots.
Tuesday on GPB.
Welcome back to Lawmakers. I'm Donna Lowry. Some of the early themes in this legislative session involve workforce issues, including housing demands, with 4 major companies, Hyundai, Rivian, SK Battery, and Q-Cells, putting plants in Georgia, and they'll bring thousands of new workers. But there are concerns that the state needs help to shore up infrastructure for that workforce. I spoke about those issues in an interview with the president and CEO of the Georgia Chamber, Chris Clark. First, I asked him what the incoming economic development will mean for the state.
These announcements from Governor Kemp come at a very unique time. I mean, we've had 4 years in a row of record economic development announcements, but these 4 projects in particularly build a pipeline of construction, of job training, of supplier networks that will be coming into the state over the next 5 years, right in the middle of what everybody assumes is going to be a global economic downturn. And so in a way, we believe this is kind of padding it for Georgia. We're very optimistic right now. We think this is going to help us move through the next 18 months of political, questionable times and really solidify Georgia as kind of the leader of the battery belt, if you would, of all these new electric vehicles, batteries, solar, all of these projects. And we're going to reap the benefits of these for the next 50 to 100 years.
Talk about that battery belt a little bit more for people who don't understand what that means and the economic development that comes with these 4 major announcements.
Well, listen, for the last 5 years, since roughly SK made their announcement that they were coming to Georgia, you've seen manufacturers, suppliers, as well as other battery plants look at the Southeast. And so essentially from kind of North Carolina, a little bit in South Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, into Alabama, and a little bit into Mississippi, this kind of region of the South has just attracted all of this investment from all over the world. But when you talk about these 4 projects or projects of this magnitude, I mean, this is unbelievable. I'll put it in perspective. I did the Kia deal in 2005, 2006. It was the biggest project in the history of the state at the time. You've essentially had 4 Kia announcements within a year and a half. And so the ripple effect of that is incredible because each one of those companies will bring suppliers. They'll bring a need for housing, opportunities for downtowns. You're going to see whole communities lifted up like we did with Kia when they went to West Point. These are game-changing economic engines that will create economic growth and prosperity and opportunities for Georgians, literally for generations to come. I mean, it really is. I don't think you can, it's impressive at any level that you look at. And what's even more impressive is if you look around the country and say, well, who else which other states are getting these announcements? They're not. North Carolina had a small EV announcement. Tennessee's had a couple, but no one's had 4. No one's had the Q-Cell announcements on top of it. And so it really is game changer for our state.
We've heard talk about the workforce trying to build up in this area. Where are we in Georgia when it comes to that?
So honestly, I think that's the 800-pound gorilla that we have to deal with. But Donna, here's the thing. We are exactly where we were pre-COVID. Pre-COVID, for every 3 jobs that were open in Georgia, 1 person was looking for a job. Now, during COVID, we got down to 2 to 1. Last summer, we were up 4 to 1. Now we've averaged back out around 3 to 1. And I think we should expect to see that for the next 10 to 20 years. You've got a couple of factors that are happening here. One, baby boomers are moving out. We'll have 73 million baby boomers retired by 2030. But the other thing that's happened is we're not replacing them. We had a demographic decline, started after the last recession, kind of added to it during COVID. And so we're actually having the smallest generation of high school students and college students that we've seen in 3 or 4 generations. And so you've got that issue that's happening. And then you've also got fewer people working today than were working 20 years ago. We've seen a 10% decline in labor participation in Georgia and basically nationwide over the last 20 years. And so we have to have plans to recruit more people to Georgia, get people that have not traditionally been working, maybe people that are ready for a second chance or men and women with disabilities back into the workforce. But then we've really got to focus on this pipeline to make sure that long-term, we've got young men and women that can connect with those solar companies, those EV companies, those manufacturers that are innovative, creative. And so that's going to take a partnership between early childhood, K through 12, technical colleges, and our universities.
And what some have referred to as a housing crisis when it comes to these jobs.
It absolutely is. And I've talked to all of these companies that are moving to Georgia, and the first thing that they say is we're most concerned about getting as many workers as we need, although we have confidence that we can do it. But then the second thing, and it's a short pause, is where will those men and women live? I talked to a business leader yesterday. His son moved back home, got married. His wife's a teacher. He said, Chris, there's no house in our whole town for under $600,000. Where in the world are young couples supposed to live? And so we do have a crisis. And I think there are three things that we ought to be looking at. One is, how do you help young men and women save so they can get access to those houses? And so some states are doing some innovative things there. And so how can we help young men and women? Number two is, how do you reduce the regulatory burden? I appreciate what Governor Kemp said in the State of the State about helping fund site readiness in communities where we have these projects to get housing started that jumpstarts the builders. But the other part of this too, and quite frankly, Donna, it's on me and you, this NIMBYism that says I only want a 3-acre house built in my neighborhood on a golf course. That's unrealistic for young men and women, and it's unrealistic for seniors. And so in a way, there's an economic case to be made here, but this is a moral issue too. We know when men and women can buy their own home, they can move out of poverty, they can have generational prosperity. But if we stack it against them and there's no available workforce, housing available there, I mean, we're just shooting ourselves in the foot and we're hurting the next generation. I read an article last week that called millennials the roommate generation, and said that they were very worried that they will never be able to move out of their parents' basement or never be able to live on their own. We shouldn't be satisfied with that. And so we are working with Chairman Washburn and a broad coalition of builders, Habitat for Humanity, legislators, partners, to develop ways and ideas and hopefully have some real strong policies this session to jumpstart this. But we're not going to solve it in a year. But particularly we have these critical areas, we have to start now so that we can be ready to go, particularly where these plants are going to be built out in the next 4 years. We've got time to build the type of housing that we need in those communities.
Let's talk about what else you'd like to see come out of this legislative session.
So, yeah, I think the other, really big issue that we've got to deal with, obviously people are moving to state. We're having new companies move to Georgia. We've got to continue to invest in our road, bridges, and infrastructure. Research that we've done said right now the average train in Georgia is a mile long. If we don't do anything in the next few years, that'll be 3 miles long. That's detrimental to small towns in South Georgia, where I'm from, where you don't have underpasses and you wait. And so improving that freight and logistics system long-term so that we can move goods and supplies safely around the state is imperative to our long-term growth. And the good news is that we were just with Dean Calvin Smyrie a few minutes ago talking about the last transportation bill that we passed 8 years ago. It's time to make that type of investment in Georgia's infrastructure again. And so that's going to be a very big issue for us this session, looking at improving legal reform, anything on workforce development, and then obviously anything that we can do to improve the healthcare system in Georgia. We're looking at bills in all of those areas.
Legal reform, tell me what you're thinking about along those lines.
Sure. So listen, we really love bragging about how Georgia ranks #1 in all these different categories. Well, recently a national group came out and said Georgia ranked 50th out of 50 in civil justice reform, basically saying that these nuclear verdicts and these frivolous lawsuits that are impacting large companies and small businesses are really becoming a problem for our companies. And so we just want a fair and balanced playground. We want to make sure that juries get all the data that they need, that you don't bankrupt a company when you go through these filings. And so we look forward to working with a lot of different partners at the Capitol to find the right balanced path to have a fair and balanced judiciary.
I want to thank Georgia Chamber President Chris Clark for that interview. We'll keep up with some of the issues he mentioned. That does it for Lawmakers Today. We'll be back on Monday for Legislative Day 9. In the meantime, get your political fix on Political Rewind weekdays at 9 and 2 p.m. on your GPB station, and look for the latest statewide news on gpb.org. Good night.